Good afternoon. Thank you to be here. First of all, many thanks to BAU and the Master in Design Research, especially Cecilia Marini, Sejano Rowan, who have coordinated and made possible this BAU Talks session. It's my pleasure to introduce Amy Ireland. Amy is an Australian writer and theorist currently based in UK. Amy's work crosses disciplinary and formal boundaries, moving into philosophy, fiction, code, occultism, performance, poetry, and sound. A research which spaces between fields such as science fiction, geopoetics, xenofuturism, and poetics of emerging technologies, as gender and technology in modernity at its core. She's a member of the trans-feminist techno-materialist collective Laboria Cubonics. She has been a guest professor and lecturer at various institutions and universities around the world, among others, University of New South Wales in Australia, Rosie Bradotti Summer School at Utrecht University, Performing Arts Forum, PAF, in France, as Goldsmith in UK. She has published widely in contemporary art journals, and her poetic and performative work has been included in exhibitions such as the 20th Biennale of Sydney, AI More Than Human at Barbican Centre in London, the Athens Biennale in 2021, Time After Time, the Polychronicity in Blockchain at Hyundai Motor Studio Beijing, that is ongoing, if I don't, if I'm not
I think it
wrong.
just closed, finished, yeah.
In Spanish, her work has been published by the Editorial Lobionte, that is here with us in the public, and in 2022, they published Philosophia Fiction, a collection of writings on philosophy and aesthetics, and her feminist and fiction text also appears in other anthologies, such as Cyberfeminismo, de Venus Matrix a Laboria Cubonics, Nuevos Vectores del Xenofeminismo, e Mundo World, Antología de Nueva Ficción, el primer volumen. In addition, Amy has been working as an editor for contemporary art and philosophy, for contemporary art and philosophy publisher Urbanomics since 2021. Okay, today is here as a member of the feminist collective Laboria Cubonics, introducing us the Xenofeminism and explaining its genesis, its meaning, and her experience in the collective of the 6 artists and theorists of Laboria Cubonic who have created the Manifiesto. Xenofeminism is inserted in a genealogical line that goes from cyberfeminism of the 90s, the technofeminism and posthumanism, until reaching the 17th of the last century to some reference of radical feminism. With regard to the reflection on the social and the emancipatory role of technology, we can certainly affirm that it has its roots in the thought of Donna Haraway, Sadie Plant, and Swalanit Firestone. But it also been related by different critics and commentators to new materialism, speculative materialism, and left accelerationism. Helen Hester, that is another component of the Laboria Cubonics group, mentions among the key concepts that profile the Manifiesto, first the techno-materialism, in second instance anti-naturalism, and then gender abolitionism. But I believe that beyond this truth concept, Xenofeminism has a lot of potential due to the very epistemological paradigm shift implicit in its own name, no? In the prefix xeno. Well, I will not any further and leave Amy explain all this concept. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federica. And thank you, Bao, for having me. Okay, well, Laboria Cubonics and Xenofeminism is a project that involves 6 different women. We created Laboria Cubonics as a name for ourselves. And at first we wanted to stay anonymous behind this pseudonym, but that became more and more impossible as we got invited to do particular things and had to turn up in person. Our names got connected to the project, and those dreams kind of slowly started to fall apart. So it's well known today that the other members are Helen Hester, Luca Fraser, Patricia Reed, Katrina Birch, myself, and the British artist Diane Bower. Before I begin talking and subject you to my particular version of xenofeminism for the next 35-40 minutes, I wanted to begin by screening a short introductory video that was made by Diane Bower, who passed away last year from pancreatic cancer, and her voice and contribution to xenofeminism are going to remain with us forever, and also will be dearly missed. So this is a video that Diane made to introduce xenofeminism. as Diane mentions in the video, this is our manifesto, by the way, if anyone wants to find it while I'm talking. As she mentions in the video, we met in 2014 in Berlin at a summer school, and it was a strange kind of context for a feminist manifesto to be born for the time. It was a conference on this nascent philosophy called neo-rationalism. The contents of the conference, or the workshops, which went over about a week, were on category theory, left accelerationism, plots and plot holes and cunning. Reza Negarestani did several talks that were kind of like his first steps for the philosophy of neo-rationalism that he's known for today. And Helen Hester did a talk on Shulamith Firestone, the American feminist whose work was published in the 70s but mostly ignored until very recently in the Anglophone world, her book The Dialectic of Sex. There are about 30 people at this summer school, and probably about 8 of them were women. And we were having these conversations, there was a lot of things being posted online, and this sentiment started to emerge from the online commentary that it was not very feminist for women to be doing maths or science. Helen was a quite well-known feminist at the time, and people were having trouble kind of putting these two ideas together. And a couple of successive nights after the workshops would end, we'd sort of hang out and talk about this, and we kind of thought it was, in a way, our presence at this particular conference was being erased by this inability to see, to make sense of women being interested in reason, in mathematics, in engineering, in technology, and in science. These things are kind of haven't been the usual fare of the feminist agenda, especially in Anglophone feminism. With a few notable precedents. So we kind of started joking around about why don't we write a feminist manifesto, and we kind of like started creating names for it, and we're toying around with a couple of ideas, and we came up, as part of this not yet real joke manifesto, the name Laboria Cubonics, which is an anagram of the name Nicolas Bourbaki, which is a French pseudonym that was made up by a group of mathematicians in France in the 1920s. And their kind of idea, this was a failed project, but it was a sort of grand, ambitious project where they were going to get together and they're going to completely rewrite the axioms of mathematics and create a new mathematics from the bottom up. And we kind of thought that the ambition and the scale of this project, and there was a kind of, they didn't take themselves too seriously as well, which was appealing about it, about Nicolas Bourbaki. We thought this reflected what we would imagine a feminist project that was connected to reason, to maths, to engineering, to technoscience, to these ideas that we were immersed in at the time. That kind of ambition was what we thought would fit that sort of project. And as the days went on, this started to become more and more real. The jokes sort of started to take on reality. We started talking about Laboria Cubonics as if she already existed. And it was proposed to us at the end of the week that we actually do write this manifesto and publish it the following year in a German translation in an anthology of technofeminisms that Armin Avanesian and Helen Hester were putting together. I think it's called Dea ex Machina. It's in German. It's got like Rosie Bradotti, Donna Haraway, and the very first publication of the Xenofeminist Manifesto in German in July 2015. So it kind of came out of a feeling of being erased, and also a sort of jokey play. In a sense, it was kind of a hypostitional moment where we had a fictional thing that became real without us really having to consciously sit down and create this thing. So So as well as the cyberfeminist influences that Federica mentioned in the introduction, as well, and Shulamith Firestone, there are some very immediate influences from the summer school. And they're the ones that I think don't get talked about or picked up on as much. So I'm going to just mention them kind of briefly here. And that's the influence of mathematical philosophy. So when Libora Kibonix talks about universalism, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, there is sitting behind that references to Badiou and Badiou's idea of the generic. And also the idea of transmodernity, which comes from Fernando Zalamea and Rosa Maria Rodriguez Madga, who are both Latin American philosophers. Transmodernism is especially interesting, I think, for the project. A really kind of quick gloss of transmodernism is that it's no use to see the grand modernist projects and modernist narratives of the early 20th century and the sort of revolutionary like universalism that accompanied that as being followed by, destroyed and followed by the postmodern horizontalism of the post-structuralist era that kind of trickles into the internet ethos of the 1990s that informs cyberfeminism as a kind of succession where everything is kind of overcoming something else. And now we're in a sort of weird post-modernism moment. Their understanding of this network of ideas is that there's a third term, and that's one that kind of moves between or sees modernist ideas and postmodernist ideas. Very crudely, a kind of horizontalism in postmodernity and a kind of verticality in modernity. Maybe a kind of totalitarianism in modernity, a tendency towards the universal, and a tendency towards particularity and subjectivity in postmodernism, not as opposed things, not as a succession, but as a network that can be moved around. And so transmodernity was an idea of a kind of modernism that transits between different structures of thinking modernity. So that's sitting there as well, transmodernity. And this prefix as well of trans becomes full of other kinds of ideas as we started to unfold it through the manifesto. So there's also Resna Garistani's neo-rationalism and the immanent understanding of reason that is proposed in that, and left accelerationism, which was another aspect of the summer school. And the kind of idea that's taken from that is that emancipation, political emancipation, does not lie just in small-scale, local, natural, kind of, getting your friends together and making a co-op or returning to the land, doing your own farming or whatever. This kind of return to small-scale, local political projects is not any kind of enemy for capitalism. It might be nice for the people who are in it, but it's not connected to anything. It's not connected to a larger political project. So their critique of what they called folk politics is also something sitting in the background of the Xenofeminist Manifesto. And then Shulamith Firestone, whose Dialectic of Sex was a kind of amazing book published in the 70s, where she basically suggests that class emancipation, every kind of emancipation, relies first on gender emancipation, especially of women from reproductive labor. And her solution for that was robots. She wanted to, what she called, cybernate daily life. So everything from childcare to childbirth would be done by robots, or by, in the case of childbirth, ectogenesis, so synthetic wombs that are outside the body. And she says if you remove this naturalized duty of childbirth from women's bodies, and you make it something that is not located in a specifically gendered body or even in a body, all of a sudden the whole political space around that shifts. So she saw that as the absolute key to kind of unlocking a cascade of other kinds of political moments of emancipation. So that appreciation for technology is also very much influential on the Xenofeminist project. Okay, so we left the summer school, and we all went back to our respective countries. I returned to Sydney, where I was living at the time, in Australia. The other members were in the UK, in Germany, Canada, in the US, I think. And we were trying to coordinate writing this manifesto. I think we were using Google Docs across 6 different time zones, and we had a very tight deadline for this German publication of the manifesto. And it was kind of chaotic. As Diane mentions in her video, all the voices in the manifesto are quite different. We found out that despite our shared appreciation for these kinds of patriarchal or non-feminist areas of interest, we also had quite different politics and different values. So trying to create this coherent entity, Laboria Cubonics, was an interesting kind of labor. And I think the fact that there is still, it's not completely smooth, there's still a bit of heterogeneity and ambiguity in the manifesto. So that came across while we were trying to write this thing. It was a sprawling document with kind of ideas everywhere, nothing was coherent. And I think in the end, we decided that this free-for-all horizontalism was not going to cut it. And we had to delegate and create a little bit of kind of like sparring infrastructural direction. So we appointed Patricia Reed to basically reorganize everything that we'd written and kind of gave her editorial power for a specific amount of time. So we had an interesting experience also about collective organization while we were writing this manifesto, which finally made it to press. It was published in German. And then we decided immediately that the best place for it in English was online. We didn't want it to go to a press where there would only be a couple of hundred copies of it maybe. We wanted it to be online, we wanted it to be free, and we wanted it to be as easily accessed by everyone as possible. And this was followed up, as you can see here, all of these different translations of the manifesto that we've got on our main page. I think there's 17 or something like that at the moment. People started to write to us and ask if they could translate it. And we made a point of making it open to translation. If there were 2 people who approached us who wanted to translate into the same language, we'd put them in contact with each other. So we tried to have one version in each language as it was proposed. But this was all completely self-organized DIY translations, people who wanted to translate it into their own language and approached us. It also has a GNU public license on it, which means that anyone can publish it. There are a couple of anarchist presses that publish versions of it. It's been published in English by Verso Press, but we've got a contract with them where all of the royalties that they get for that go to a women's charity in London. So Laboria Cubonics doesn't make any money from any of this, neither do the publishers. So the text is as free as we can make it. We also put it on GitHub with the idea that we could track versions of it so people could perhaps make additions to it or use it for their own project, and they could fork it and make a version of it on GitHub so you could see different versions of it. So there was this kind of logic of diffusion that was influenced a little bit by the free software movement at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to talk about the contents of the manifesto and give you guys a kind of primer on it. Because, as I said, it has a little bit of heterogeneity to it. We're told sometimes that it's too philosophical, or it's too dense, and it is very much about emphasizing the complexity of reality, something that the manifesto form, which is kind of about simplifying things, is almost opposed to. So there's an interesting tension in what we're trying to describe and how we're trying to say it. I think the most important thing to go into reading the manifesto understanding is that we're not trying to give a specific set of prescriptions for politics right now. What we're trying to provide is a scaffolding for thought of how a politics that is oriented toward a future feminism can be built. So it's abstract because it's just trying to describe a meta level of how we should arrange the structure, the abstract structure of a future feminism, a xenofeminism. It also is explicitly not revolutionary. It wants a strategic and piecemeal adjustment of our models of politics, of the social, and of gender justice. But this is a project of adjustment and strategy that is always ongoing, that doesn't have an end. So it's a kind of constant tinkering. It's not clear-cut and defined and imposed as a political program from above. It's oozy and slimy and it's pragmatic. It's very much against this revolutionary idea of the new dawn. I'm just going to read a quote from the manifesto that I think expresses this pretty nicely. The xenofeminist transformation is a transformation of seeping, directed subsumption rather than rapid overflow. It's a transformation of deliberate construction, seeking to submerge the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy in a sea of procedures that soften its shell and dismantle its defenses so as to build a new world from the scraps. So it's kind of got a bit more of a like scavenger approach than a like burn it all down and start from a blank slate approach. It also treats as positives certain things that in leftist feminist discourse have been seen as negative or have been freighted with a history of negative connotations. The first of these is in the title, Xenofeminism, a politics for alienation. Alienation is not necessarily seen as a positive thing. The title for alienation, a politics for alienation, means at once to address a state of alienation, but also something that is pro-alienation. The way that we mean it in the manifesto is as a rejection of the given, of the is, of the way that things are, and especially when these things, the established regime, is called nature with a capital N. This is just the way things are. To be alienated from nature, to be alienated from the current state of affairs, is to give you a gap in which you can start to posit oughts or is. What if it was like this? Actually, it should be like this instead of like this. So alienation for us is the space that opens that difference from what is, where you can say what could be or what ought to be instead. The ideas of norms. There's a grand and a brilliant feminist history of subverting the norms. But this is kind of understanding the norm as a single monolithic way of being, rather than a tool that can be used to decide what kind of oughts or what kind of possibilities you want to posit to get yourself away from the status quo, from nature. So if you think of norms as something that isn't like a monolithic way of structuring reality, like patriarchy, for example, but as something that you can say, compared to the way things are, this is how it could be. If you can posit that could be, or that ought to be, as a norm, and other people understand it as a place where we're aiming to get to, this gives you a kind of way to guide your political trajectory. So creating norms as a positive tool of constructing a politics on the go. The universal, absolute enemy of postmodern feminism, because it's seen as an absolute or an inflated particular. We're trying to posit a universal, as I said, influenced by Badiou's generic and these ideas from Zellermeyer and transmodernity, where it's a constructible universal, something that you create on the go. And also having a conspiratorial attitude towards hegemony. What if you could turn hegemony to your own ends? Hegemony is libidinal. It creates a kind of mass desire. So if you could create, it's just kind of like a memeplex, really. So if you can use hegemony as a tool, that can be something that could be appropriated for feminist ends. The wager being for us that there's been a kind of stagnation of feminist projects. It's still part of this kind of postmodern idea of particularity, of subjectivity. Xenofeminism wanted to take the risk of coming back to some of these ideas that had been discarded by feminists and trying to see if we can turn them towards feminist ends, to kind of say, well, maybe we only think of them as masculine or as patriarchal because we too are subject to this idea that there are certain things that are naturally masculine or male or patriarchal and certain things that aren't. Whether or not that was successful, we can talk about at the end. Okay, and the manifesto is broken into 6 sections. They're all kind of roughly themed. I'm going to summarize those after I've gone through the manifesto, so you kind of understand what I'm talking about. But they're all named from processor flags in computing, and the numbering of the sections of the manifesto is in hexadecimal. So there's this kind of reference to computation and to the ethos of hacking, and programming. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go through, it's fairly short, the manifesto, it's only a couple of pages long. I'm going to go through each of the sections and basically just give you a kind of aphorism one-liner that I think summarizes each proposition in order to give us a kind of like overview of what is being said. Again, like I said, it's kind of a scaffolding. Its idea is to invite content to fill it, and that's something that has happened. But it's not giving you specific political projects. Okay, so the first section is called 0, and the first paragraph basically posits, it's about scale. Diane Bauer was playing on this in the video that I showed by having the text of the manifesto running really quickly along the bottom with a technique that's used for speed reading, kind of lining it all up along a middle vowel or something like that, while the rest of the video is going on to kind of point out that our attention economy, our way of absorbing information, is no longer really keyed to the environment that we live in. Just go online. I mean, like, it's easy to get information fatigue. We're saturated with information that we cannot absorb. Also, we're understanding now processes that are going on in molecular levels, in cosmic levels, but we can't assimilate all of these to our human cognitive apparatus. So the first point in the Xenofeminist Manifesto is that the environment we currently live in, especially the global capitalist environment, has outgrown the scale at which we can cognitively digest and perceive the world. So feminism should be adapted to the non-human scale of our contemporary situation. Why should being alienated from some so-called essential or natural state of being be understood as a bad thing? For capital N, nature, the natural order, and the given, the way that things are, these are the primary sources of oppression for women, for queers, and for gender non-conforming people. It's just not natural. All of these arguments use this justification of the form what is equals what ought to be. So it doesn't make use of a possible gap between what is and what ought to be. It's not like we have this, but what ought to be is something different. Those naturalist kind of arguments function in this way. So if alienation names the gap between what is and what ought to be, then it's a tool that grants us freedom. It's what separates us from the natural. So xenofeminism is vehemently anti-naturalist. Xenofeminism is neither techno-utopian nor techno-pessimist. We've been accused of being techno-utopian before. We need technological design that understands that technology is neutral, but it can be appropriated for all kinds of despotic ends. But we need a kind of technological design that takes on this risk rather than just repudiating the technological wholesale. We also need to understand how technology is in a feedback loop with culture and think on both sides of this feedback loop. So we need to repurpose technology both in technological disciplines but also in the cultural arena. So this means generating a female, queer, gender non-conforming techno-culture and responding to risk rather than just pretending that there is none or rejecting technology. Capitalism, despite its own propaganda, has led us to a state of stagnation. And we need a new kind of politics that will allow technological novelty to flourish, especially technologies that generate new reproductive and pharmacological tools, address environmental cataclysm, and can automate menial, dangerous, and underpaid labor, which is the kind of work that often is done by women. So we're pro-innovation, pro-technology, and anti-capitalist. Science and reason are weapons, and they can be used for feminist ends. To claim that science and reason are by nature patriarchal is just to succumb to the doctrine of the natural order. They are not expressions of gender, or of masculinity specifically, but suspensions of gender. If rationalism is currently dominated by men, then that's all the more of a reason for it to be appropriated and not rejected by feminists. Okay, second section, interrupt. Feminist agendas are too often far too modest. Feminists need to increase the scale of their ambitions. Capitalism operates at a universal, global scale, so we need a universalist politics to fight it. We need to deal with the contemporary political complexity that we face by understanding processes in terms of the micro, the meso, and the macro, just like an engineer. Linking these things together is how we build a universalist politics without imposing a universalist idea that's already complete from above. As well as building new technologies, we need to mobilize existing digital technologies positively towards feminist and gender non-conforming ends. Digital feminism especially has been too concentrated on projects that are defensive and that express a negative kind of freedom, which is freedom from something. Still freedom, but it's a defensive freedom. So digital self-defense, protection from doxing and online sexual harassment, protection of images, etc. We want a feminism that's more than this. We want a positive freedom, a freedom to, not just a freedom from patriarchal networks, but a freedom to use digital technology for explicitly feminist ends. And for this, we need a feminism that is at ease with computation. Embrace the alienating aspects of technological mediation. Steal and repurpose technology from capitalism. Section 3 is called Trap. Contemporary leftism is plagued by illusion on the one hand and melancholy on the other. The illusion that the left will prevail just because the world tends towards justice or because they are morally superior inhibits strategic work and large-scale collective organization. On the other hand, melancholy and nostalgia from some past revolutionary glory just leads to despair, and it saps politics of all of its libidinal energy. Xenofeminism rejects illusion and melancholy as political inhibitors, and it's for a libidinal kind of politics. You cannot kill capitalism by seceding from it, or with small-scale local activism alone. To make a call to scale back, to be more local, or to put the brake on technological innovation is a luxury that's actually only available to the privileged few. Mass manufacture and mass production is something that those who are the least privileged live by. So it's not an idea for everyone to urge this putting on the brakes of technological innovation. Instead, we need to scale up and to connect local activism to universal politics. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to give you just the aphorisms. Authenticity, naturalness, and identity are not emancipatory vectors for women, queers, trans, and gender non-conforming people. They need to invest their power in the synthetic, the artificial, and the non-natural. So this kind of idea of an authentic identity still belongs to the logic of the oppressive regime. Cyberspace is not the space of gender experimentation and freedom that it used to be in the 90s when it was text-based. It's now image-based, and this offers a lot more traction for policing identities and for just this idea of identity politics being the currency in which we express our politics. So this is something that we need to not valorize in and for itself. We must design political, social, and technological infrastructure that frees us from the tyranny of this natural identity and manifest instead a queer, trans, and feminist culture. Fourth section, parity. Xenofeminism is gender abolitionist. I'm going to explain this one because this has been a point of confusion too. Gender abolition does not mean the abolition of markers of gender difference so that everyone is the same. What it means is an abolition of the categories that determine possible and legitimate genders in advance, along with the social and discursive power that is attributed to certain positions granted within that grid. One example is the binarism that ushers in the whole notion of passing in trans representation. The in-between is just as valid a position. So gender abolition is a formula that gestures toward a future in which difference might become so alien that we no longer have a contemporary representational system sufficient to its description. Let 100 sexes bloom. Xenofeminism affirms a universal that's not imposed from above, but it's built by transiting through difference at different scales. And this universal is always open. It's always subject to updating and to modification. Fifth section, adjust. The more you know about something, the more you can hack it. Technoscience and knowledge together give us the ability to engineer anything in the world. Xenofeminism is normatively anti-naturalist and it espouses ontological naturalism. This is one of the most philosophical sections of the manifesto. But what it kind of means in a nutshell is that Xenofeminism rejects an intransigent, static, capital N nature, the natural order, the way things are, by affirming the plasticity of lowercase n nature. The fact that everything can be hacked. There is no supernatural aspect of the self that you can't change with science, so long as you have the resources and the knowledge to do so. The soul doesn't exist, for example. We can change everything about ourselves, so long as we know enough to do so. Carry. Digital technologies and material realities are in a feedback loop. Altering one can alter the other. So rather than arguing for the primacy of the virtual over the material or the material over the virtual, feminism needs to see them as intertwined and pay attention to how an intervention in one sphere creates an effect in another. 0x14, hack public space. 0x15, hack private space, especially the space of the family. 0x16, hack the body. Get rid of medical and pharmaceutical gatekeepers. 17, if we break networks up into the micro, the meso, and the macro, everyone always focuses on the micro and the macro, not the meso. This is the space, according to Xenofeminism, where politics really happens, because you're connecting these two levels that often don't cross paths. So how do you connect something horizontal to something vertical? You need to focus on this space in between. So Xenofeminism focuses on the meso, especially in terms of political coordination. How can we move fluently between local punk activism and grand political narratives without denying either one? Only by reactivating a hegemonic desire for the future can we rediscover the temporality of the future. Xenofeminism is a platform, not a program. We don't look for a blank slate. We want to assemble this politics from the scraps of a rotting world while we're in the middle of it. Xenofeminism is a politics of the future. But a truly alien future is not representable in advance. By using the languages and tools and concepts of the given, of capital N nature, of the existing regime. Because Xenofeminism is creating new norms and new oughts in the terrain in which it deploys itself, it's subject to constantly mutating. And because of these two things, we call Xenofeminism in this last section a moving X on a mobile map. Its content isn't filled in yet, and it's constantly moving across this shifting terrain of political complexity. The manifesto ends with a reiteration of the call to destroy capital N nature, which I'm going to read directly from the manifesto because I don't think I can put it any better. Nature shall no longer be a refuge of injustice or a basis for any political justification whatsoever. If nature is unjust, change nature. So overall, this is the whole manifesto, basically. This in the screen before. Overall, the whole structure basically is arranged through these processor flags, which kind of have suggestive associations. So 0 is sort of the groundwork, it's the axioms, it's what we need to get this politics in motion. Interrupt is, well, the next 3 sections, the next 2, interrupt and trap, are both the critical sections. So interrupt is how can we look at movements in existing politics that we appreciate, but that we think need to be intervened in to connect them to a xenofeminist project. And trap is things to avoid. The second part is the positive part of the manifesto. So parody is kind of talking about this idea of the xenofeminist universal. Adjust is talking about using technology to alter nature. And carry is thinking about how to carry on a feminist and leftist political legacy. And overflow is the structure of the project. Okay, I'm going to stop there and let you guys ask some questions or whatever. But I hope that that's kind of given you some traction, at least, or an introduction, or some traction on the manifesto if you have already read it. There is a Spanish translation in existence that you can download for free off the website. So yeah, I mean, you can use this as a sort of guide to what's going on if you wish. Okay. Thank you.
Funciona, sí. So now we have 15 minutes for questions, if there are any, and funciona? Sí, no? Okay. And maybe I'd like to start with 2 questions that I wrote down during the talk. One is on the epistemological level of the manifesto, and is a question concerning the call for alienation and destruction and rationality of the Xenofeminism, and is related maybe with the theory, with the concept of Spivak and Rosi Braidotti, who have spoken about strategic essentialism. I don't know if you know about this. So according to them, to Braidotti and Spivak, they say that it's necessary to examine what can be useful in the discourse of universalization, and then to analyze the limits, of this discourse. So I want just to ask if the call for alienation and rationality of xenofeminism can be reconnect to this concept of Spivak and Rosi Braidotti. And another question is about how xenofeminism position itself in relation to the Donna Haraway situated knowledge, as Donna Haraway is one of the reference, and the situated knowledge is like quite in contrast to universalism.
Yeah. Okay, strategic essentialism. I think that this is, in a way, kind of descriptive of my relationship to xenofeminism, because the thing that I ended up, I'm very connected to certain aspects of the manifesto still in my practice and in my writing, but there are some things that I think I sort of was trying out precisely in this way to kind of test where the limits are, and universalism is one of the things that I got stuck on, found a limit to, and have since abandoned in my personal work, not as part of Laboria Cubonics. So in a way, it did involve kind of strategically inhabiting this position where I was called upon to speak for the universal and to sort of represent its case. But I found myself often in situations like this, and someone would be like, well, give us a practical example of how we can create a universal from my friend's project of like some kind of like local DIY thing to like the left accelerationist political future or something like that. And the answer that Laboria Cubonics always had was purely mathematical. It was like, the answers that I had was like, I was kind of, they were talking politics and I was like telling them category theory. And I realized that there was kind of no way, not for me anyway, maybe one of the other members of the group, probably Luca Fraser would be better at doing this particular job. But I was struggling to connect an explanation of this, how this universalism can actually be empirically deployed or deployed in the like real world. And maybe that's just because I haven't had an opportunity to try to like test these myself. But I felt like I came across a limit by inhabiting it. So I think Laboria Cubonics herself is very adamant about sticking by this mathematical essentialism, which is different from strategic essentialism. But I, through doing this, found myself going through the process described as a strategic essentialist process, and came out the other side no longer espousing universalism. Situated knowledge, yeah, it's completely opposed. And again, this is something that I'm much more comfortable with thinking about things in terms of their situatedness than in terms of the universal. And then the project of neo-rationalism, which was one of the original influences for that, is something that I think is really interesting, but I don't personally still see its emancipatory borders. I think that, I guess my kind of like nutshell answer to this is every time anyone proposes a universal, there is some libidinal source. It's not free. It's never free of desire. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a personal take on that, though.
Okay, thank you. Some questions?
Thanks for the talk. At the beginning, you mentioned the the intention of this to be democratic, and I get when you mentioned when you said we put this on the internet and it's free and it's open and the translation process I think is amazing, but I wonder how you navigate the difference between circulation and comprehension, because this is a very niche language, and I was wondering how you manage this difference between making something democratic in terms of how it's circulating around and how it's comprehensive.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's something that we didn't really, I mean, we kind of were speaking in the language that we were using in the situation that we met in, which was a philosophy summer school. And I think part of the idea of putting it on GitHub and making it something that could be forked, we originally also sort of had a very public invitation for anyone who wanted to call themselves a xenofeminist to do so and to make works. And that started to happen, but it also started to create a kind of murkiness that meant the original concepts that we thought were actually doing something interesting to feminism, giving it a different direction, especially in terms of epistemology, to what feminisms had been doing before that, was just being kind of a bit lost, because all of these other different ideas were coming in and the project had no kind of consistency anymore. But that was kind of our response to realizing that this language wasn't really politically available. I think what we when we're talking about making memes in the manifesto, when we talk about hegemony as a memeplex, the idea is that we understand that politics has to have a libidinal content, and it has to have some kind of way that it can be accessed without being able to explain what ontological naturalism is, for example. But yeah, the gap between like saying that you want that in a politics and it actually happening is something that we've kind of like left for others to do. And it has happened successfully in some projects, I think. But it's something that we ourselves never kind of followed up on or tried to kind of like, yeah, address. But I do think that that's a legitimate issue with the manifesto, yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks again for the talk. I don't know if this is actually working, but kind of bouncing off of what you just said as well. My first approximation to Xenofeminism was through Helen Hester's introduction. I wondered, I guess I noticed you've been very, well, it appears you've been very careful with saying this is what I think, and this is what's actually what we as Laborie Kubniks did. How's that work when you sort of split off into the, like, you'll give a talk, Helen Hester wrote a book, do you interact still and discuss how you're going to represent xenofeminism, or?
Yeah, I mean, we all still talk about xenofeminism, we're all still friends. It's coordinated mostly from its HQ at Patricia Reed's place in Berlin. So she is like our kind of like, she's always been the kind of coordinator, I think. But when we get invited to talks, I think this is kind of one of the failures of the idea that we wanted to be pseudonymous from the start. That we would work as a group, we would continue like creating papers that would be signed by Laborie Kubniks, and no one would really know who we were. If we did talks, we'd find some way to kind of anonymize them, or at least make it not clear who Laborie Kubniks really was. And I think that what happened was that we did realize we all had slightly different politics. We had different agendas for Laborie Kubniks. We were also in different countries, which made it hard to kind of do things together, even though we were always talking online. So in a way, it kind of became this project where we put this sort of call for this kind of feminism to exist, this experiment in how can you think feminism through these ideas like reason and universality and norms happen. But none of us really, we weren't together enough to be able to continue the kind of like perpetuation of Laboria as an entity. So I think like if you look at our website, there are individual papers written by us, all of us. Sometimes there are collaborative interviews, but it's very much, we sort of split quite naturally into like 6 different entities, which I think is a failure. I think it would have been really cool to be able to kind of keep Laboria as this kind of like demonic entity that we created and kind of lives on. I mean, she's a bit undead at the moment. But like, I think the thing that we all kind of enjoy and we all still talk about together is just seeing where other people take it. And I think that's really cool. Like putting something out there and it becoming, I mean, it's inspired music, it's inspired theater, it's inspired design, it's inspired like dance, performance pieces. It's inspired all kinds of like stuff, so it's kind of cool. I mean, she went out there in the world, and sometimes I'm kind of look around and I'm like, there she is. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how the relationship, I think, it is today.
Thanks for the talk. And my question is, there's a relationship or a connection between xenofeminism and race or class, because race, I mean, gender is not the only area from oppression, but also race. And I try to think from the bell hooks perspective. So as Braidotti also said, we all are mortal, but some are more mortal than others.
Can you repeat that last phrase?
Yeah, I really don't know the exact the way to say it in English, because I read it in Spanish, but Braidotti says that we all are mortal. I mean, we are all going to die at some point, but some of us or someone are more mortal than others. sorry, this like this in this pyramid. It's not only about gender, but also about race and class. So
there is race and class are addressed in the manifesto twice. One in a section where we kind of talk about intersectionality, which race and class obviously play into, and how the universal can be used to create a different kind of intersectionality, which is not like a cross-section of particularities. So, I don't know, you can be a black woman who's a lesbian or whatever, and then you kind of like figure out from there where people sit in this pyramid. The proposition is to think about it, this is my point from before about category theory, to think about it in terms of the invariant. So it's a kind of category, it's a mathematical system of finding something that is similar in a range of things that are different, and using that as a way to like describe equity or coordinate power or information or resources. But for me, this has always seemed like something that is very, very obscure and hard to actually apply to a real world situation. So we do mention race and class, but we also tried not to talk too much about race and class because we wanted this to be a feminist manifesto. And for race, there are like, you know, there are plenty of manifestos to do with race and class in the future. So we wanted to kind of keep it focused too, so it just didn't become a manifesto about everything sort of thing. So they're in there, but yeah, they're kind of like as part of the whole project, sort of thinking about them in terms of how do we construct a universal that is just, basically.
There is not any more, so maybe we can finish. Cecilia? Yeah? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for staying on a little bit longer than planned. And thanks for having me.